Hello, and welcome to Into Another World, a brief history of Isekai. I'd like to start off with a little bit about myself. You can find me on Twitter with the username @Jaharis48. I'm also a part of the panelist group Otaku Brain Trust. I've presented a longer version of this panel twice before, but this is my first time recording it instead of doing it live, so please forgive any technical difficulties or mistakes in editing. Since this is also about half as long as the usual panel, I've had to make some cuts. Namely, I'll be primarily focusing on anime as opposed to related media such as manga and light novels. And I'm only going to be covering the history of Isekai anime up to around the 2010s. So enough of that, let's get started. But before we look at the history of Isekai, it's best to try to come up with a definition for the term itself. After all, it's good to know what we're talking about here. Thankfully, the kanji that make up the word Isekai do serve to provide us with something to work off of. The first character, the I sound, means different, strange, or unusual, whilst the second and third characters, which form the sekai part of the word, have the meaning of world, society, or realm. As such, it's no surprise that Isekai is usually translated as different world. Using that as a base to work off of, we can come up with a more specific definition. Wikipedia has their own definition, of course, but I personally define Isekai as a subgenre of Japanese fantasy that revolves around a character or group of characters who have been transported by some permanent or near-permanent means to a universe or world that is substantially different to that of their own. While the term is used predominantly for Japanese works, for the sake of context and analysis, it can be extended to cover fiction from outside of Japan. That being said, I'll primarily be focusing on anime in this panel, as aforementioned, as this is an anime convention after all, and I only have 30 minutes. While it's important to know what is Isekai, it's also important to know what isn't. There are a lot of works out there that share some or many similarities with widely accepted Isekai stories, but which themselves aren't considered to be Isekai. If we are to look at the history of Isekai, we must know what to include and what to exclude. I typically exclude most time travel stories from the category of Isekai, for example. The destination world in these stories is usually Earth, either in the past or near future, and is thus not substantially different to that of our own. Additionally, the main characters can typically travel with relative ease back and forth in time, and are thus not bound to a single setting. Similarly, I also don't consider most works of sci-fi involving interplanetary travel to be Isekai, even though they do technically feature different worlds most of the time. The setting of these works is typically space itself, not any single world. Thus, from a storytelling perspective, the different planets are simply different locations held within the same common realm of space. As always, though, there are plenty of exceptions and edge cases to these guidelines, a few of which will be mentioned later. Few genres are truly closed concepts. We merely come up with these definitions for the sake of clarity of discussion. But before we get into the history of Isekai, it's worth taking a brief aside to understand the actual mechanics of the process. How exactly do you get Isekai'd after all? Well, there are two broad categories of Isekai premises. Isekai Teni, or transition into another world, and Isekai Tensei, or reincarnation into another world. The former of these two categories was more popular in previous decades, whilst the latter has come to the forefront in the 2010s, though both are still present in good number. It's also possible to divide the first category into subcategories, which along with reincarnation describe all the basic methods of Isekai that I've come across. There might be a few others. Summoning type isekai stories involve a character or group of characters who are intentionally brought into another world via magic or similar means. They're typically pulled into this world rather than pushed into it, and the character is usually given some sort of task upon arrival. They were summoned for a reason, after all. Examples of these stories include Dog Days and Overly Cautious Heroes. Portal-type isekai stories, on the other hand, involve characters who travel from one world to another via some sort of portal, passageway, or device. While there may be a higher purpose behind this event, it's often unintentional or random in the universe. These portals are usually, though not always, two-way devices. Examples include Gate and Outbreak Company. And finally, simulation-type stories are similar to the portal-type ones, but instead of a gateway, the device involved is some sort of computer simulation. These usually take the form of advanced multiplayer video games. Examples of this type include .hacksign, SAO, and Log Horizon. And then, the second of those two broad types, of course, is reincarnation. And reincarnation isekai stories simply involve a character who dies in one world and is reincarnated into another. It can be random or purposeful, and it usually involves trucks or other large vehicles. Examples include Reincarnated as a Slime, Konosuba, and Ascendance of a Bookworm. With all that being said, it's about time to get to the actual history of the subject. History isn't the title of this panel, after all. Now, certain elements of what we call isekai storytelling have existed in stories for quite some time. The tale of Urashima Taro is commonly cited as an early inspiration for isekai. In this classic Japanese folktale, a man saves a turtle and is brought to the fantastical dragon palace under the sea as a reward, where he meets a beautiful princess named Otohime. This tale dates back to at least the 8th century AD, during Japan's Nara period. Going back even further, one can find isekai-esque elements to mythological stories involving journeys to the underworld, such as Inanna's descent to the Sumerian underworld of Kur in ancient Mesopotamian mythology, and the abduction of Persephone by Hades in Greek mythology. Underworlds, afterlives, and paradises from various religions are frequent settings of isekai-like stories, with settings such as the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, and the fairy realms and other worlds of Celtic mythology, places such as Onwin, Tir Nanog, and Avalon, continuing to have a definite influence on modern fantasy. Stories closer to what we'd recognize as isekai begin to appear by the 18th century. Many tropes and motifs found in isekai stories today can either be traced back to this era or are the result of convergent evolution. And in fact, many isekai anime themselves were inspired by some of the novels that started coming out around the 18th century. Examples of such works include Jonathan Swift's 1726 novel Gulliver's Travels. While the work is entirely located on Earth, the different settings featured in it are quite different from regular 18th century British society. The setting of Laputa in this novel will go on to form the inspiration for the 1986 Ghibli anime film Castle in the Sky. Now, Castle in the Sky is not really an isekai, but still, it's a very interesting film. 1865 would give us Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, better known simply as Alice in Wonderland. This famous novel does not closely fit our definition of isekai. It does fit closely our definition of isekai, and it was very popular in Japan. Receiving its own anime adaptation, in fact, in 1983, called Fushigi no Kuni no Alice, and going on to have a clear visual influence on a variety of Japanese works, such as Madoka Magica and Fate Extra. Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars from 1912, the start of the Barsoom series, is another Western novel that served to inspire anime. The Barsoom series contains several recognizable tropes. It features a protagonist who is transported to another world, in this case a feudal, fantastical version of Mars, where he's more powerful than anyone else thanks to growing up in Earth gravity, and where he saves and then has a romance with the princess. You have to have your heroine, of course. And indeed, the Barsoom series of novels was cited by Hiroki Hayashi, the co-creator of the 90s Isekai OVA series El Hazard, The Magnificent World, as a direct influence on his work. Other important and potentially influential works include The Wizard of Oz, both the 1900 novel and the 1939 movie, the former of which received an anime adaptation in 1986, and C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series. So if isekai-like stories have been around since the 19th century, when did they actually start appearing in anime? Well, we should perhaps just look to the start of anime for that, and we can look to the 1960s, the decade in which TV anime as we know it really started to kick off. Toei's 1966 adaptation of Sally the Witch is most famous for being the first magical girl anime, but it also does fit the category of reverse isekai. Unlike in regular isekai, this story involves a character, Sally, who is transported from a magical world to that of our own. I personally consider reverse isekai to really be its own thing, just due to, even though it's a similar type of story, the actual end result is very different with these types of stories. You get much more of a fish out of water sort of deal, but where the character is someone we are not familiar with. Whilst in standard isekai, we're kind of familiar with the character and we're seeing a strange world through their eyes. That being said, Sally's still worth a mention here. It is a very important show after all. Entering the 70s, we see that the reverse isekai magical girl trend continues with shows such as Majoko Megu-chan from 1974, and in 1976 we get something a bit closer to what I consider to be a genuine isekai anime, in the form of Tatsunoko Productions' rather bizarre series called Paul's Miraculous Adventure. Now this is more of a dimension-hopping story than a straight-up isekai, and to be honest, I haven't actually seen this show, any of it really, and it only appears to have been released in English in the Philippines. It does seem to have been quite successful in certain European markets, so. Whilst the 60s and 70s had inklings of what was to come, the 80s was really when anime that we'd immediately recognize as isekai became a thing. In 1983, Yoshiyuki Tomino of Mobile Suit Gundam fame introduced Japan to the world of Byston Well, in the isekai mecha anime Aura Battler Dumbine. Here we have all the trappings of the genre, a character transported suddenly into a world replete with feudal politics, warfare, and magic, and Dumbine was decently popular in its day, and it would not be the only mecha isekai anime of the 80s. Indeed, starting only a few months after Dumbine was Super Dimension Century Orgus, the second part of Big West Super Dimension series. This ambitious mecha anime featured a device known as the Space-Time Oscillation Bomb, essentially a weapon of mass isekai that when set off resulted in multiple different alternate realities being intermingled and mixed into a patchwork world. The mecha isekai trend continued throughout the 80s, with shows such as God Mazinger in 84 and Machine Hero Wataru in 88 being representative of this subgenre. Now, so far all the anime we've talked about, apart from the magical girl shows, have had male protagonists. However, two 80s isekai anime bucked that trend and served to foreshadow what was to come in the following decade. 1985's Leda, The Fantastic Adventure of Yoko, is a wonderful one-shot isekai OVA featuring a distinctive Magitech setting and a very enjoyable female lead character. This isekai has some magical girl warrior vibes to it, and is a good example of the high production value OVAs that would come to characterize the late 80s and 90s anime industry. It's also just a personal favorite of mine. Similar to Leda, Tobira o Akite is a one-off isekai anime with a warrior girl as its lead character. Leda and Tobira were some of the first isekai anime with female protagonists, but they certainly would not be the last. Indeed, the 1990s would see the real rise of isekai as a truly popular genre of anime. And this rise would be led by anime that were either adaptations of shoujo manga or heavily inspired by the shoujo manga aesthetic. And for those who don't know, shoujo manga are manga that are primarily targeted towards a younger female audience, as opposed to shonen, which are primarily targeted towards a younger male audience. Foremost amongst these series was Magic Knight Rayearth, a 1994 adaptation of the Clamp manga series by the same name. Its mixture of action, adventure, and fantasy would make it highly popular and set the tone for isekai in the 90s. Rayearth was followed 1 year later by Fushigi Yugi, which actually predates Rayearth in manga form. These two shoujo manga adaptations would become some of the first isekai anime to garner large followings in the West, followings that they definitely deserve. They're both very enjoyable series. Forming the trio of the big 90s female-led isekai anime is The Vision of Escaflowne, a highly ambitious 96 anime that was Studio Sunrise's first return to this genre since Dunbine back in the 80s. Now, The Vision of Escaflowne I've often heard described as an anime that does everything. Really anything you can look for in anime, it's probably an Escaflowne. Fantasy isekai with male leads did continue to be made, of course. The prime example of which is El Hazard, The Magnificent World. Inspired by A Princess of Mars, this isekai, with its fun characters and Middle Eastern themed setting, is a personal favorite of mine, and is actually perhaps my single favorite isekai anime. It would go on to receive a sequel OVA, as well as a television version known as El Hazard: The Wanderers. On a slightly different note, airing in 1996 was the rather oddball series Those Who Hunt Elves. Besides being another favorite of mine, this isekai series is notable for being one of the first ecchi isekai anime, as well as one of the first modern late-night anime. The success of Evangelion, a little bit prior, had encouraged producers to think, hey, let's stick some of the shows that might previously have been OVAs based on their content on television, but at a late-night time slot, and it worked. Most isekai anime following this will be late-night anime, and most anime you're probably watching nowadays are late-night anime. Another aspect new to isekai in the 90s was the trapped in the video game formula, which began with Enji Knight Ramune and 40 in 1990, a series that also continued on with the mecha isekai trend from the 80s. 1999 would see two more computer simulation type isekai stories, the very famous Digimon Adventure, which garnered a huge international fan base, and the charismatic magical girl series Corrector Yui, which is a really superb little series that I wish was fully translated in English. Don't think it is yet. Some other notable isekai from this decade include the Alice in Wonderland inspired 98 series Alice SOS, 1999's Dual Parallel Trouble Adventure, which has an interesting plot in which the isekai world is an alternate version of the real world, set down a different development path by a single decision. This is also in the same universe as Tenchi Muyo, kind of unofficially, according to its creator, who is also the co-creator of Tenchi Muyo. And the infamous 96 OVA series Garzy's Wing, of course, a series directed by Tomino and set in the same world as Aura Battler Dunbine, but known primarily for its rather atrocious quality and rather hilarious dub. In contrast to the decades both before and after it, the 2000s was a surprisingly quiet time for isekai anime. mostly characterized by a continuation of the shoujo and computer game isekai of the 90s. In a way, the 2000s can be seen as a calm before the storm. The proliferation of both the light novel adaptations and isekai light novels in the 2000s paved the way for several future isekai outline adaptations, but few actually aired during this decade. The decade did begin with a heavy hitter, though, in the form of Sunrise's adaptation of Rumiko Takahashi's Inuyasha. Whilst technically a shonen series, it is reminiscent of the 90s shoujo isekai, particularly Fushigi Yugi, since along with Fushigi Yugi, it's a bit of a time travel or time slip story. But I do consider it to be an isekai, at least for the sake of this panel, because its more fantastical elements set it apart from a straightforward time travel series. It's also very popular, and will be receiving a sequel pretty soon. Studio Ghibli's 2001 films, Spirited Away, harkens back to the mythological origins of isekai. Whilst not commonly thought of as an isekai anime by Western fans, I have seen it frequently included in Japanese polls of the best isekai stories. Continuing on, 2002's 12 Kingdoms can be seen as one of the last big 90s shoujo-style isekai stories, or one of the first since the novels for 12 Kingdoms actually began in 1992, predating both Rayearth and Fushigi Yugi. And .hack sign helped pioneer the MMO isekai subgenre and was very much ahead of its time in serving as a part of a multimedia project. It was released alongside video games, novels, and all sorts of other material, and is really just a wonderful, often overlooked show. Perhaps the most prescient of the 2000s isekai, though, is Familiar Zero. Airing in 2006, this summoning-type isekai story foreshadowed the rise of male-oriented isekai harem anime, mostly adapted from light novels as A Familiar Zero was. Which brings us on to, of course, the 2010s. The 2010s is a decade when isekai became everything. Quite frankly, there are too many 2010s isekai to even try to begin to discuss the majority of them here. Needless to say, this is the decade which saw isekai truly take over the medium. And perhaps no single series is more emblematic of this trend than Sword Art Online. While Reiki Kawahara's novel series began back in the 2000s, the 2012 adaptation of SAO by A1 Pictures was such an immense success that it easily became arguably the series' single most responsible for the isekai boom of the 2010s. Its popularity encouraged anime producers to further plumb the depths of isekai light novels and find new material for adaptations. And the growth of all these outline adaptations was mutually beneficial to the light novel industry itself, with isekai light novels exploding in quantity and popularity. Especially on in terms of fan-generated content, or amateur content, I should say, on websites such as Naro, where isekai is very common, and many actually very well-known isekai anime began as web novels published on Naro or similar websites. SAO also served to repopularize the video game isekai setting, which hadn't really been seen since .hack sign. And indeed, the 2010s would see many isekai, including ones not technically set in video games, use the trappings of video game mechanics. If you think of shows such as Death March or even Danmachi, which is not really an isekai, they still use video game mechanics, like leveling up and whatnot. The 2010s aren't all about SAO though, and while I don't have time to discuss everything, I will take the opportunity to name some of my personal favorite 2010s isekai anime. Shows such as Dog Days, which has a very fun, lighthearted setting, but still a good amount of action and combat. Outbreak Company, which is a very funny show and a kind of satirical look at the Japanese government's use of soft power and just sort of otaku culture in general. Konosuba, which is just very funny in general. ReZero, which has probably my favorite world building and lore of any isekai light novel story. And Tensura, or at that time I got reincarnated as a slime, which has a very nice protagonist and also just a nice easygoing atmosphere. Current trends in isekai include the proliferation of mid to high fantasy settings and the increasing use of video game mechanics as a part of the setting, as aforementioned, even for series not ostensibly set in video games. Shoujo-based and mecha isekai, which are very common in the 90s and 80s respectively, have mostly disappeared, though female-oriented isekai are starting to make a comeback potentially with series such as Hamefura, which is airing this year, and a few manga that are out there which are kind of similarly inspired by otome games or similar sorts of works. Looking into the future, I predict that peak isekai has or likely will come to pass in Japan for light novels, meaning we will possibly see a reduction in isekai anime by around the mid-2020s. At least that's my prediction. However, it probably won't die off. Not only is it a subgenre with good history and long roots, but isekai is very popular in the West. Was something kind of ironic is that in the West we kind of think Japanese are obsessed with isekai, but when Japanese look at the light novels that do well in America, they kind of laugh about how it's almost all just isekai. In particular, technological progress, especially in the realm of virtual reality, means that technology-based isekai will probably continue to hold interest amongst audiences for the foreseeable future. They are a kind of form of science fiction after all, and science fiction pretty much always remains relevant as long as there is science. And with that, it's about time to wrap up this panel. I didn't have time to go into everything I would like to go into, so if you have any questions you want to know about my sources, or you just want to talk about anime in general, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Jaharis48. I'd like to thank you all for listening to my panel, and I hope I'll be able to do this again, preferably in person, at Otakon or other conventions in the future. And with that being said, so long, and be careful of all those trucks.